On the 8th of September 1923, 14 US Navy ships were heading south from San Francisco Bay to San Diego Bay. The Clemson-class destroyers were running a 24-hour training exercise from Northern California to Southern California. These ships were the newest and latest to be built since the First World War, with the US Navy using this opportunity to showcase their muscle to the rest of the world. The drill, however, did not go as planned. Destroyer Squadron 11, or Desron 11, made their way south down the west coast through dense fog in the September sunset. USS Delphi, the flagship of the fleet and head of the column, was led by Captain Edward H. Watson, an experienced officer who had previously received the Navy Cross for his service during World War I, where he was in command of battleship USS Alabama. USS Delphi itself was captained by Lieutenant Commander Donald T. Hunter, who was also acting as the squadron's navigator. Trailing directly behind Delphi was the USS S.P.Lee, followed by 12 other ships, including the USS Woodbury, USS Nicholas, USS Fuller, and USS Chauncey. Orders were for Desron 11 to follow Delphi in column formation, with the flagship being responsible for navigation of the entire fleet. Unusually large swells and currents had already begun testing the squadron's capabilities that evening, with the ships fighting their way through the rough waters. 7 days prior to the operation, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, Japan had suffered a magnitude 7.9 earthquake on their mainland, causing widespread destruction and leaving over 142,000 people dead. It's thought that the shockwaves triggered by the Great Kanto earthquake caused irregular sea levels over a number of days, leading to abnormal currents across the ocean. Many ships had encountered navigational problems as a result of these unusual currents during that time, including steamship the SS Cuba, running aground on San Miguel, an island in an area of the Santa Barbara Channel. Despite SS Cuba being stranded along the route that the fleet would be cruising past, Watson refused to assist, as their primary focus was to complete the mission at hand. As the night grew darker and the fog began surrounding the seas around them, visibility became extremely limited very quickly, and Delphi had to adapt her way of leading the other ships safely onward. As well as various upgrades to the ship's armament and design, these destroyers were equipped with state-of-the-art radio direction finding, which was still in its infancy and not widely trusted amongst naval officers. This equipment would allow the ships to utilise a series of stations on shore at Point Arguello, ultimately triangulating their position to understand their location in events such as these. Instead of using this new technology, Hunter decided to ignore the bearings from the RDF, believing them to be erroneous. Instead, he navigated using a widely used practice known as dead reckoning, whereby a ship's path is estimated from their course and speed, as measured by propeller revolutions per minute. The problem with dead reckoning, however, is that it doesn't consider the effects of other variables, such as currents or wind, so can be incorrectly measured depending on the circumstances. Due to the rough sea levels and large swells caused by events in Japan the week prior, Hunter's estimations were incorrect, with the ships being slowly pushed off course due to the strong undercurrents. Instead, the column were near Point Arguello at Honda Point, also known as Point Pedernales, in an area of offshore cliffs known as the Devil's Jaw. Due to its notoriously rocky hazard formation, ships and boats dating all the way back to the 16th century had fallen victim to this area of water and become mysteriously lost along the coast, earning the phrase, the graveyard of the Pacific, with the same level of infamy as the Bermuda Triangle. Unbeknownst to Hunter and Watson, they continued to use their method of navigation to guide Desron 11 through the thick, dark fog. Believing to be south of the treacherous Point Arguello based on their calculations, Watson ordered the ship to turn eastward 95 degrees into what they believed was the Santa Barbara Channel. At that moment, the Delphi received a signal from a station based on Point Arguello, indicating they were incorrect and were higher north than estimated. Hunter, believing his navigational evaluations were correct, decided to continue along their path, taking a hard port turn at around 9 p.m. With the Delphi now heading straight towards the coast at around 20 knots, the column behind began to follow suit in a tight formation, trusting its flagship to guide them through the rough open waters. Within minutes, disaster struck as USS Young, third in the column, began to rise out of the water before splashing back down into the sea. Upon realising they had hit a submerged reef, water began rushing into the starboard side of the ship after receiving a huge laceration on its exterior from a jagged pinnacle. It quickly began to tilt onto its side within 90 seconds before the captain ordered all men to evacuate its hull. Sailors began either spilling onto the side of the ship or were trapped within its shell, with some sacrificing themselves in the engine room, manning the boilers to keep them extinguished until their last breath to avoid causing a deadly explosion. Their sacrifice would go on to save many of the crew, who were left clinging on to the submerged ship, avoiding the cold, choppy waters below. Meanwhile, the Delphi, still heading directly towards shore at roughly 37 kilometers per hour, ran bow first into the Devil's Jaw, with her stern breaking off as she hit the rocks head-on. Upon impact, the crew immediately began emergency procedures and wailed their sirens to warn the rest of the ships following behind. She remained afloat for a short while before capsizing, as the sailors began frantically assessing the damage in confusion and shock. Following closely behind the Delphi was Lee, who, after seeing her leader suddenly stop and initiate emergency lighting, took evasive action immediately. The captain assumed that the Delphi must have hit ground amongst the northern tip of San Miguel Island, so ordered an immediate turn to port to evade collision themselves. In reality, they were actually much further north, and by turning port, they were only headed towards more rocks along the coastline. S.P.Lee eventually ran aground, despite valiant efforts by the crew to save the ship from making impact, whilst Nicholas, trailing closely behind, followed suit. The ship's skipper did his utmost to prevent the loss of the destroyer as the sea waves stroked over and pushed her into Honda's rocks, but it was eventually taken by the currents and drifted towards a clump of rocks with a 25-degree starboard list, coming to rest parallel with the shoreline. The USS Woodbury was following behind Young, and upon noticing it coming to a halt ahead of her, began to turn to starboard to avoid collision. This led to Woodbury instead hitting a submerged reef and eventually colliding alongside a small rocky island. Crewmen immediately began rigging lines across the gap of tumbling surf between the rock and the destroyer in attempts to anchor it in place, as water began pouring into the boiler and engine rooms. With the ship losing power quickly, the waves continued to strike her hull at force, causing her bow to rise and fall treacherously in rhythmic fashion. Realising the fate of its sister ship ahead, and not taking chances, the crew began to clamber across the chasm and one by one abandoned ship, settling on the small island, which would later go on to be renamed Woodbury Rock. USS Farragut was a lot further behind than the previous ships who had just perished to the rocks, and after seeing Young capsize, it put its engines into full astern to slow down and reverse away from the rocks. Despite running aground, she managed to free herself from the reef below, but this emergency manoeuvre came at a cost, causing her engines and generators to fail, knocking out her lights and casting her into darkness. The USS Fuller, next in line behind Farragut, was now approaching at speed, unable to see its sister ship ahead, which had suddenly plunged into obscurity. Before it was too late, the speeding vessel collided with the Farragut, sideswiping it before drifting starboard and onto the rocks beside the Woodbury. Fortunately for the crew of the Farragut, they were able to limp away from the carnage around them and anchor safely away from the other ships, suffering only minor damage in comparison to their comrades. Next in line was USS Percival, who managed to avoid grounding along with the Summers, despite the latter's bow and propellers grazing the reef below whilst performing an emergency turn. The Chauncey, however, was not as fortunate and was the last of the ships to run into trouble. In an attempt to rescue sailors from the capsized Young, she cruised by the sinking ship to get close enough to assist, but in doing so, managed to inflict wounds to herself. The exposed and still spinning propellers of the Young sliced through the side of Chauncey, cutting through the hull and into the engine room. The onrushing water filled the opening, killing Chauncey's engines and all power to the ship before she was then carried helplessly onto the rocks, where she remained upright but defeated. Within the space of a few mere minutes, the crews of 7 of the 14 ships now found themselves in mortal danger, with over 800 sailors and crewmen now stranded either on their warship or the surrounding rocks which conquered them. The Fuller eventually broke in half and sank, as only Nicholas's situation was deemed safe enough for her crew to remain on board until daylight, with the other 6 frantically doing their best to abandon ship and reach dry land. The crew of the Fuller and the Woodbury were forced to take refuge on Woodbury Rock, whilst S.P.Lee were evacuated to the shore by means of a raft ferry. The crew of the capsized Young continued to hang onto the side of the hull, unable to reach safe land and losing strength as the waves battered against the perilous ship. By sheer luck, the destination that the Chauncey drifted aimlessly to after suffering her power outage helped bridge the gap between the Young and the safe shore, but there was still no secure passage down for the crew of the Young. Whilst the survivors clung to the doomed destroyer, one of the crew, boatswain mate Arthur Peterson, heroically swam through the hazardous waters from his wreckage over to the Chauncey with a lifeline, attaching the rope so that the sailors could safely traverse to their upright sister ship. Soon after, a 7-man life raft from the Chauncey was on its way to Young as a makeshift ferry, making 11 trips in total to save 70 survivors. With the pandemonium unfolding before them, local ranchers on shore began seeking ways to help the stranded sailors to safety, helping them up the jagged rocks throughout the night. Fishing boats nearby helped pick up some of the crew from the 2 ships, stranded on Woodbury Rock. The 5 other destroyers of Desron 11, who were left unscathed at Honda Point, also facilitated in rescuing sailors aboard the wreckages, as well as those who had been thrown into the water. Injuries of the survivors ranged from hypothermia and exhaustion to broken bones and lacerations inflicted by the razor-sharp volcanic rocks they clung onto. Despite the trauma they had gone through, however, they were considered the lucky ones, as 23 men never made it ashore, with 3 dying on the Delphi and 20 perishing on the Young. After the disaster, no attempt was made to salvage any of the wrecks at Honda Point, due to the nature of the damage that each ship sustained. The wrecks of all 7 ships and their equipment was sold to a scrap merchant for a total of $1,035. Inquiries began on the 17th of September to determine the cause of the disaster, and took over a month to return their findings, in a document with over 1,000 pages of evidence. It was concluded that the incident was directly attributable to bad errors of judgment and faulty navigation. 11 officers of Desron 11 were court-martialed, with blame assigned to each of the captains that ran their crew aground for blindly following their leader and not following tradition of being responsible for their own navigation. This was the largest single group of officers ever court-martialed in US Navy history. Captain Edward Watson was stripped of his seniority, with 3 other officers admonished and all others acquitted. Yet Watson was ultimately commended by his peers and the US government for assuming full responsibility for the disaster and setting an example to others. Rather than blame a variety of factors, including the abnormalities caused by the earthquake a week prior, he took full accountability for the deaths of his crewmen on his shoulders and bared the brunt of criticism for misguiding his squadron. The Honda Point disaster at the Devil's Jaw took the lives of 23 men and 7 ships that fateful day, and became one of the largest peacetime losses of US Navy ships in history.